The auditorium was already packed when Tommy walked through the heavy wooden doors. His heart was pounding so hard, he could hear it in his ears. Everywhere he looked, he saw designer clothes, expensive watches, and the kind of confidence that came from never worrying about money. Tommy looked down at his own jacket. It was clean. His grandmother had made sure of that. But there was no hiding the fact that it was old. The zipper didn't work anymore, and there was a patch on the elbow where she'd sewn up a tear. His shoes told the same story. They were the only pair he owned, and he'd been wearing them for 2 years. He clutched the permission slip in his hand. The paper was already wrinkled from how many times he'd folded and unfolded it, reading the words over and over to make sure this was real. He was really here, at Riverside Academy, the fanciest school in the whole city. Tommy had never set foot in a place like this before. The floors were so shiny he could see his reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Even the air smelled expensive, like furniture polish and fresh flowers. He found a seat in the back row, trying to make himself invisible. But it didn't work. A girl with perfect blonde hair and a dress that probably cost more than his grandmother's rent turned around in her seat. She looked Tommy up and down, then leaned over to whisper something to her friends. All 3 of them giggled. Tommy felt his face get hot. He knew what they were saying. He'd heard it all before at his own school. Poor kid. Charity case. Doesn't belong here. The girl's name was Victoria. He'd heard someone say it earlier. She turned around again, this time speaking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I didn't know they were letting anyone in now, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Did they lower the standards or something? Her friends laughed harder. A boy sitting next to her, wearing a blazer that looked like it came straight out of a magazine, smirked and shook his head. Probably some community outreach thing, he said. You know, make them feel good about themselves. Tommy wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. He wanted to stand up and walk right back out those doors, but he stayed frozen in his seat. This whole thing had started 3 weeks ago at the community center. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the after-school program, had rushed up to him with a flyer in her hand and excitement in her eyes. Tommy, you have to do this, she'd said, practically shoving the paper into his hands. Riverside Academy is having their annual talent showcase, and they've opened up 5 spots for kids from community programs. You have to audition. Tommy had laughed. Me? At Riverside? Mrs. Patterson, those kids had been taking piano lessons since they were like 3 years old, with real teachers, in actual music schools. But Mrs. Patterson wouldn't take no for an answer. She knew Tommy's story. She knew about the broken keyboard he'd found behind a restaurant 3 years ago. She knew how he'd taught himself to play by watching free videos on the library computer. She knew he came to the community center every Tuesday and Thursday, the only times the piano room was available, and practiced for 2 straight hours. Talent is talent, she'd said firmly. Doesn't matter where it comes from. So Tommy had sent in a video of himself playing. He'd recorded it on Mrs. Patterson's phone, sitting at the community center's old upright piano with its chipped keys and broken pedal. He never actually thought they'd pick him, but they did. Now here he was, surrounded by kids who'd probably never worried about anything in their entire lives. Kids who had grand pianos in their living rooms. Kids whose parents paid for private lessons twice a week. The lights dimmed, and a woman in an elegant suit walked onto the stage. She was the school's principal, and she welcomed everyone to the showcase with a bright smile. One by one, the performers went up. A girl played violin so perfectly, it sounded like a recording. A boy played classical guitar with fingers that moved like lightning. A pair of sisters performed a piano duet that made the whole audience gasp. They were all good, really good. Tommy felt the doubt creeping in with every performance. What was he thinking? He didn't belong here. Victoria kept glancing back at him, whispering and giggling with her friends. Each time she did, Tommy wanted to leave even more. Finally, after what felt like forever, the principal looked down at her list and called out, "Next up, we have Tommy Rodriguez." The whispering got louder. Tommy stood up on shaky legs and started walking down the aisle toward the stage. "Good luck, scholarship boy," Victoria's friend whispered loudly enough for half the row to hear. More laughter followed. Every step felt like it took an hour. The auditorium wasn't that big, but the walk to the stage felt like miles. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, judging him, wondering what he was doing here. A couple of parents in the third row exchanged looks. One woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something behind her hand. Tommy caught the words "community program" and saw her raise her eyebrows. When he finally reached the stage stairs, his legs felt like rubber. The stage lights were blinding. He couldn't see the audience anymore, but he could feel them watching, waiting, expecting him to fail. The piano sat in the center of the stage under a spotlight. It was the most beautiful instrument Tommy had ever seen. A Steinway grand piano, glossy black, with keys that looked like they'd never been touched. Nothing like the beaten-up old piano at the community center. Tommy walked over and sat down on the bench. It was padded and comfortable. It didn't wobble like the stool he was used to. Behind him, someone coughed. It wasn't a sick cough. It was an impatient cough. The kind that said, "Get on with it already." Tommy's hands were shaking as he placed them over the keys. Tommy's fingers hovered over the piano keys, not quite touching them. The ivory felt cool under his trembling hands. He'd never played on anything this nice before. The community center piano had keys that stuck sometimes. Two of them didn't even make sound anymore. But this instrument was perfect. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His throat felt tight. The stage lights were so bright they made his eyes water, but he could still sense the audience out there in the darkness. Waiting, watching, judging. From somewhere in the third row, he heard a phone buzz. Someone was texting. They weren't even bothering to pay attention yet. Why would they? To them, he was just a poor kid who got lucky enough to get a pity invite. Tommy closed his eyes for a second. In his mind, he wasn't at Riverside Academy anymore. He was back in his grandmother's tiny apartment, sitting on the floor with that broken keyboard he'd found in the dumpster. Have you ever felt a dream burning so brightly inside you that it felt like the only thing keeping you warm? For a young boy named Leo, that dream wasn't just a warmth. It was a roaring fire, and its fuel was the sound of a piano. But Leo's world was far from the grand concert halls he dreamt of. He grew up in a small, cramped apartment where the thin walls let in the sounds of the bustling city, but offered little room for a grand piano. His family loved him dearly, but their pockets were often empty. Food was a daily concern, and luxuries like music lessons were as distant as the stars. But Leo had a secret. Every day after school, he'd sneak into the local community center. Tucked away in a dusty corner was an old, forgotten upright piano. Its keys were yellowed, some were chipped, and it was terribly out of tune. To most, it was just a piece of junk. To Leo, it was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. He couldn't read music, not a single note. So he taught himself. He'd press a key, listen to the sound, and try to replicate the melodies he heard on the radio or in his head. His fingers, small and clumsy at first, would dance across the keys, sometimes creating a jumble of noise, but other times, just for a moment, a flash of pure, beautiful music would emerge. Those moments were everything. The janitor at the center, a kind old man named Mr. Henderson, found him one evening. Instead of scolding him, he saw the fire in Leo's eyes. He saw the raw, untamed talent. Mr. Henderson had once played the cello, and he knew what that passion felt like. He didn't say much, but from that day on, he'd leave the door to the piano room, unlocked, and a small plate of cookies on the bench. Sometimes he'd sit quietly in the back, listening as Leo's jumbled notes slowly started to form coherent, breathtaking melodies. He was Leo's first audience, his silent supporter. As Leo grew, so did his skill. He learned to pour his feelings into the music. The hunger he felt became a somber, longing melody. The joy of a rare treat became a light, dancing arpeggio. The city's cacophony transformed into a complex, powerful chord progression. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was his diary, his voice. He spent every spare moment with it, his fingers flying, his body swaying with the rhythm only he could feel. He was creating his own world, one note at a time, within the four walls of that dusty room. He was no longer just a poor kid from the city. He was a composer, a performer, an artist in the making. One afternoon, a woman entered the community center. She was looking for directions, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she heard the music flowing from the piano room. It was a sound full of raw emotion, a melody that told a story of struggle and hope. She was a retired piano teacher, Madame Dubois. She had taught some of the city's finest musicians, but she had never heard anything like this. She followed the sound and found Leo, lost in his music, his eyes closed, his soul bared for all to hear. She watched, mesmerized, until the final note faded into silence. When Leo opened his eyes, he was startled to see her. He expected to be told off, to be kicked out. Instead, Madame Dubois simply asked, "Who taught you to play like that?" Leo, shy and intimidated, mumbled, "No one. I just play." A smile spread across her face. She saw not just talent, but a diamond in the rough. "Would you like to learn for real?" she asked. That question changed everything. For the first time, Leo's dream felt like it could be more than just a secret kept in a dusty room. It felt possible. Madame Dubois took Leo under her wing. She didn't have much money herself, but she had a wealth of knowledge and a grand piano in her small home. She taught him the language of music, the notes, the scales, the theory. It was hard. Leo's hands were used to his own way of playing, and the discipline of classical training felt restrictive at first. He had to unlearn bad habits and train his fingers to move with precision and grace. There were moments of frustration where he wanted to give up and go back to his old, familiar piano. But Madame Dubois was patient. She saw his struggle, but she also saw his incredible ear and his profound connection to the music. "Your heart knows the music, Leo," she would say. "We just need to teach your fingers to speak its language fluently." She didn't try to erase his unique style. She helped him refine it. She showed him how the structure of Bach could strengthen his compositions, how the passion of Chopin could deepen his emotional expression, and how the playfulness of Mozart could add a new layer to his melodies. Leo soaked it all up. He practiced relentlessly, his days filled with scales and sonatas, his nights filled with his own compositions, which were now richer and more complex than ever before. He was bridging the gap between his raw, self-taught talent and the polished world of classical music. His family, seeing the change in him, the focus and determination, did everything they could to support him, often giving him their share of a meal so he would not be hungry during his long practice sessions. Word of the prodigious young pianist began to spread through the local music community. Madame Dubois arranged a small recital for him at a local church. Leo was terrified. He had only ever played for Mr. Henderson and Madame Dubois. Now he would be playing for a room full of strangers. His hands were clammy. His heart was pounding. As he walked onto the small stage and sat at the piano, a wave of self-doubt washed over him. Who was he, a boy from the poorest part of town, to be sitting here? He looked out at the expectant faces, and his mind went blank. He couldn't remember a single note. Just as panic began to set in, he saw Mr. Henderson in the back row, giving him a quiet, reassuring nod. Then he saw Madame Dubois, standing in the wings, mouthing the words, "Tell them your story." And finally, he saw his family, their faces beaming with a pride that filled him with strength. He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes, and he began to play. He didn't play a piece by Bach or Mozart. He played his own composition. It was a piece about a small boy in a big city, about a dusty old piano, about hunger and hope, about kindness from a stranger, and the guidance of a teacher. The music flowed from him, telling the story of his life. The notes painted pictures of his cramped apartment, the sound of the city, the joy of discovering the piano, the frustration of learning, and the soaring hope of his dreams. The audience was captivated. They weren't just listening to music. They were feeling a story. They felt his struggle, his passion, his triumph. When the final triumphant chord echoed through the church, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the room erupted. The applause was deafening. People were on their feet, many with tears in their eyes. They hadn't just heard a pianist. They had witnessed the birth of an artist. That night was the beginning. A scout from a prestigious music conservatory was in the audience. He offered Leo a full scholarship on the spot. It was a dream come true, the key to a world he had only ever imagined. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But Leo was no longer the boy who had to sneak into a community center to play. He was a pianist on his way to the grand stages he had always dreamt of. His story reminds us that talent can be found in the most unexpected places. It shows us that a dream, no matter how impossible it seems, is worth fighting for. And it proves that with passion, perseverance, and a little bit of kindness from others, you can create the most beautiful music, even when you start with nothing but silence. Leo's journey from a dusty room to the grand stage wasn't just about music. It was about the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome, to create, and to inspire. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with me. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that inspire. Let me know in the comments what dream you're chasing. I'd love to hear it. Until next time, keep the music playing. 3 rows back, a woman who'd been checking her email put her phone in her purse. Her husband, who'd been staring at the exit sign and wondering how long this would take, shifted in his seat and leaned forward. Tommy didn't notice any of it. His eyes were closed now. He wasn't in the auditorium anymore. He was inside the music, living in the world that Chopin had created almost 200 years ago. The piece started to build. The simple melody grew more complex. Tommy's right hand danced across the higher keys, while his left hand provided a steady, rolling foundation underneath. The 2 hands were having a conversation, asking questions and answering them. His fingers moved faster now, but every note was controlled, precise. The weeks and months of practice were showing. All those hours on the broken keyboard. All those Tuesday and Thursday sessions at the community center, playing the same measures over and over until his fingers ached. It was all coming together now. A man in the 5th row sat up straighter. His name was Mr. Harrison, and he wrote reviews for the City Arts Journal. He'd only come tonight because his niece was performing. He'd been prepared to sit through an hour of decent student recitals, politely clap, and go home. But this was different. His trained ear caught things that most people missed. The way Tommy shaped each phrase. The subtle way he pushed and pulled the tempo, making the music breathe. The dynamic control, moving from whisper soft to powerful without any awkwardness. This kid wasn't just playing the notes. He understood the music. Mr. Harrison pulled out his phone, but not to text. He opened his voice recorder and pressed record. He had a feeling he was witnessing something special. On stage, Tommy moved into the faster section. His fingers flew across the keys in a blur of motion. This was the part that had taken him 3 months to learn. The part where his hands had to move independently, doing completely different things at the same time. Left hand, steady octaves marching down the keyboard like footsteps. Right hand, a waterfall of notes tumbling over each other in perfect rhythm. He'd practiced this section so many times that he'd lost count. On winter nights, when his hands were so cold, He could barely feel the keys. On summer evenings, when the heat made the apartment feel like an oven, when he was tired, when he was frustrated, when he wanted to give up, Mrs. Patterson had found him crying once, his head down on the community center piano. "I can't get it," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I've been trying for weeks, and I just can't get it right." She'd sat down beside him. "Tony, do you know what separates good musicians from great ones?" He'd shaken his head. "Good musicians play until they get it right. Great musicians play until they can't get it wrong." So he'd kept going. And now, under the stage lights of Riverside Academy, his hands knew what to do. They moved without him thinking about it. Muscle memory taking over, the music swelled. Tommy leaned into the piano, his whole body involved in the performance now. This was the moment where the piece shifted from delicate to powerful, where Chopin showed his genius. In the audience, people had forgotten to breathe. Victoria's mouth was slightly open. The phone in her hand was completely forgotten. She watched Tommy's hands move across the keys and couldn't believe what she was seeing. How was this possible? He was just some kid from the community program. He wasn't supposed to be this good, but he was. He was better than good. The music teacher, Ms. Chun, had her hand over her mouth. Tears were forming in her eyes. She'd heard the audition video, of course. That's why she'd fought so hard to get Tommy into the showcase. But hearing him on that old recording was nothing compared to this. This was transcendent. Tommy brought the music down to almost nothing, a quiet moment that made everyone lean forward in their seats. His touch on the keys was so light that the notes barely whispered. You could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. Then, like a wave building in the ocean, the music started to rise again. Slowly at first, then faster, louder, more intense. Tommy's hands raced across the keyboard. The left hand thundered with deep bass notes. The right hand sang out the melody with crystal clarity. His foot worked the pedal, blending the sounds together into something beautiful and heartbreaking. This was the climax of the piece, the moment everything had been building toward. The music filled every corner of the auditorium. It bounced off the crystal chandeliers. It vibrated through the expensive seats. It wrapped around every person in the room and demanded their attention. A few people had tears running down their faces. They didn't even realize they were crying. Mr. Harrison's hand was shaking as he held his phone. In 20 years of reviewing concerts, he'd rarely heard anything like this, and never from a 14-year-old kid who taught himself on a broken keyboard. Tommy played on, pouring everything he had into the music. Every lonely night. Every time someone had laughed at his worn-out shoes. Every hour his mother had worked to keep them afloat. Every sacrifice his grandmother had made. Every doubt he'd ever had about himself. It all went into the music. The piece was almost over now. Tommy brought it back down, returning to that delicate, questioning feeling from the beginning. But it was different now. Sadder, wiser. Like someone looking back on everything they'd been through. His fingers slowed. The notes became softer, more spaced out. And then, with one final gentle chord, it was over. Tommy's hand stayed on the keys. His eyes were still closed. His chest was heaving from the effort. A single bead of sweat ran down the side of his face. The auditorium was completely silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Not a sound. Tommy opened his eyes slowly. He lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. For a moment, he just sat there, not sure what to do next. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Tommy's heart sank. They hated it. They must have hated it. That's why no one was clapping. He started to stand up, ready to walk off the stage in shame. And that's when the auditorium exploded. The sound started like thunder. People jumped to their feet, so fast that chairs scraped against the floor. The applause wasn't polite or measured. It was wild, uncontrolled, the kind of clapping that made your hands hurt. Tommy stood frozen at the piano, completely stunned. He blinked against the stage lights, trying to process what was happening. "Bravo!" someone shouted from the back. "Bravo!" Another voice joined in. Soon the whole auditorium was echoing with it. "Bravo! Bravo! Bravo!" Ms. Chon rushed onto the stage, her heels clicking against the polished wood. She pulled Tommy into a hug, and he could feel her shoulders shaking. When she pulled back, there were tears streaming down her face. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice cracking. "Tommy, that was absolutely extraordinary." The applause kept going. 30 seconds. A minute. People weren't stopping. Tommy looked out at the audience. Everyone was standing. Even the people who'd been checking their phones. Even the parents who'd whispered about him. Even Victoria. Victoria was on her feet, clapping along with everyone else. But her face was bright red, and she wasn't looking at the stage. She was staring down at her expensive shoes, her jaw tight. Mr. Harrison was clapping above his head, a huge smile on his face. The woman next to him was wiping tears from her eyes with a tissue. Finally, after what felt like forever, the applause started to fade. People began to sit down, though the energy in the room had completely changed. The air felt electric. Tommy walked off stage on shaky legs. His hands were trembling even more than before. But this time, it wasn't from fear. The moment he stepped into the wings, Mrs. Patterson was there. She must have driven straight from the community center. She grabbed him in a bear hug and squeezed so tight he could barely breathe. "I told you," she whispered fiercely. "I told you that you could do it." The rest of the showcase continued, but Tommy barely registered it. He sat backstage in a folding chair, his mind spinning. Other performers came and went. They were all talented, all polished. But something had shifted in the room, and everyone felt it. When the showcase ended and the lights came up, Tommy thought he could finally slip out quietly and go home. He just wanted to get back to his grandmother's apartment and tell her everything that had happened. But the moment he stepped into the lobby, people swarmed him. A tall man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. It was Mr. Harrison, the arts reviewer. "Son, I need to talk to you," he said, pulling out a business card. "I write for the City Arts Journal, and I want to do a feature on you. What you just did up there, that was professional level playing." "Where did you study?" Tommy felt his face get hot. "I didn't really study anywhere. I taught myself mostly. And I practice at the community center twice a week." Mr. Harrison's eyes went wide. "You taught yourself?" "That piece?" Tommy nodded. The man looked like someone had just told him the sky was green. He shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. That piece takes most students years to learn with private instruction. I've been working on it for 8 months, Tommy said quietly. Before Mr. Harrison could respond, a woman in an elegant dress approached. She introduced herself as Professor Martinez from the City Conservatory of Music. "Tommy, I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to our youth program," she said. "We meet every Saturday. Private instruction, ensemble playing, music theory, all of it. Completely free." Tommy's mouth fell open. "Really?" "Really," she smiled. "Talent like yours doesn't come around often. It would be our honor to help you develop it." More people wanted to talk to him. A man who owned a music store said he'd donate a real keyboard to Tommy's home. A woman who ran a foundation said she wanted to sponsor him for summer music camp. The offers kept coming, one after another, until Tommy's head was spinning. Through the crowd, he saw Victoria standing by the exit with her parents. She was watching him, her expression complicated. After a moment, she said something to her parents and walked over. The crowd parted for her. Up close, Tommy could see that her eyes were red. "That was incredible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for what I said before and for laughing. I was wrong about you." Tommy didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her how much her words had hurt. But looking at her face now, seeing the genuine shame there, he just nodded. "Thanks," he said simply. Victoria nodded back and walked away quickly, her head down. The principal approached with a warm smile. "Tommy, we'd love to have you consider transferring to Riverside Academy. We can arrange financial aid, and our music program is one of the best in the state." Tommy's mind was reeling. This morning he'd woken up in his grandmother's apartment, practicing on his broken keyboard. Now people were offering him scholarships, interviews, donations, and a chance to attend the fanciest school in the city. Mrs. Patterson put her hand on his shoulder. "It's a lot to think about," she told the principal. "Why don't we set up a meeting next week to discuss the details?" The principal agreed, and slowly the crowd began to disperse. Parents took their kids home. The performers packed up their things. The auditorium lights started to dim. Tommy found himself standing in the parking lot with Mrs. Patterson as the evening air cooled around them. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Tommy let out a long breath. "I don't know. Like I'm dreaming, maybe?" She laughed. "You're not dreaming. You earned every bit of this." That night, Tommy rode 3 buses to get back home. His grandmother was waiting up for him, sitting in her usual chair with the TV on low. "How did it go, Mio?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope and worry. Tommy sat down on the floor next to her chair, the same spot where he'd set up his broken keyboard 3 years ago. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. Then he told her everything, about the stage, the mockery, the silence before he played, the music, the standing ovation, the offers, all of it. His grandmother listened with her hand over her heart. By the end, she was crying. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. "I'm so proud." 3 weeks later, something happened that Tommy never expected. A video of his performance started spreading online. Someone in the audience had recorded it, and it went viral. "Poor kid silences wealthy crowd with piano performance," the headline read. Within days, it had millions of views. The local news wanted to interview him. National blogs picked up the story. His phone, which was old and barely worked, kept buzzing with messages. But the thing that mattered most to Tommy came on a Thursday afternoon. He was at the community center for his regular practice time when a group of kids from his neighborhood showed up at the door. They pressed their faces against the glass, watching him play. Tommy stopped mid-song and opened the door. "Do you think," a little girl asked shyly, "you could teach us?" Tommy looked at their hopeful faces. Kids just like him. Kids with worn-out shoes and big dreams. He smiled and opened the door wider. "Come on in." As the kids filed in and gathered around the old piano, Tommy realized something. His gift had never been just for himself. It was meant to be shared, to inspire, to show other kids that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. The piano didn't care if his jacket had a broken zipper. It didn't care about his shoes, or his address, or how much money his family had. The piano only cared about the music, and the music belonged to everyone.